In 1933, of course, Germany voted Hitler to be the Chancellor of Germany, and of course there was this rise of the persecution, which eventually ended up in the Holocaust.
I was very friendly with Hans. We played together as children and also at school. But after Hitler came to power in 1933, he was rather strange, and I had very little contact with him. At a school outing, we went to one of the nice places in Moravia, and we went by train, and suddenly we saw the other schools, children or students, across the platform, and they were shouting abuse to us, and I was amazed that the ringleader was Hans, my mother's friend's son. I was terribly disappointed.
We lived in a flat over the corner shop in this town, and we had a view of the road. And one day I looked through the window and I said to my mother, "Look at this man, he's dressed in like khaki trousers and funny trousers and black boots and a funny hat." My mother pulled me away from the window and she said, "Whenever you see anybody like that, do not approach him, do not talk to him, keep your distance, walk in the gutter."
I was the only Jewish pupil at the school, and I was not asked any more questions by the teachers. Nobody wanted to sit beside me. There was just one lesson where I was important, and that was science lesson, which was not really science lesson. It was called Rassenkunde, which means racial science. And I was put in front of the class, and the teacher pointed out that the back of my head was shaped differently from the back of the heads of the Aryan children.
A few years later, I was taking my bicycle into the center of the town. It's a big square with like a fountain in the middle. And I used to ride round and round, you know, didn't go very far. And one day I bumped into another boy and knocked him off his bicycle. And he wasn't a Jewish boy. And I was so scared. I ran home and told my mother, cried my eyes out. I thought I was going to be killed. That's the way we felt at the time. Nothing happened, but I never rode my bicycle there again.
I also was forced to write an essay about Hitler's Mein Kampf, which of course I'd never read. But I'm just still not sure whether they found a joy of mocking me in some way, or whether they wanted to make me feel happy, because, I mean, but I got very good on it. I don't think all the teachers really agreed with Hitler, but so as not to lose their jobs, they had to very much pretend that they were Nazis.
I'm Sylvia Jason, widow of Professor Gerald Jason, previously Gert Jakobowitz. That was his father. And his father was in the army and fought for Germany in the First World War. He was a happy little boy. They lived in a flat above the shop in Wedding. But in 1935, when the Nuremberg laws came out, he had to go to a Jewish school across the city and travelled by underground to get there on his own. And he played at being a detective on the way. He enjoyed his life. He was quite happy, except for the background noises that were going on, the background of Judenraus and Heil Hitler when they had their rallies. It was as if it was a huge football stadium shouting Judenraus.
We started seeing a lot of Nazis walking around, and occasionally there were parades in that square, and we watched from our window. We were so scared. Marching up and down, they had these flags and singing, and everybody else was singing, and that was very frightening.
And of course I was old enough to realize all that when the SR stood in front of our shop and did not let customers come in. They wrote on the shop windows, they wrote Judenschwein, and you don't need any translations, I expect. And other nasty things. My father put into the shop window the Iron Cross, which he had won during the First World War. It did not make any difference.
So by the time 1937, 38 came, some business people mainly just disappeared into concentration camps.
I was in France when Hitler invaded the country, Belgium, Holland and France. And I wanted to work as a doctor. I wasn't able to work as a doctor. My father insisted that I stay put. When my mother came over, I stayed with her for a few days. She met my friends, and I pleaded with her, stay with us, stay with us. I said, I can't leave your father. And the same happened to my sister. To see these young children clinging to their mother, I think it's terrible.
I do remember Kristallnacht.
It was the 10th of November. School was only a few minutes away, and my little brother was at home. Of course, it was his 3rd birthday, and we were going to buy him the little chocolates and little bits. And when we came out of school, just up the road, there was a big van or lorry there, I don't remember. And we couldn't get into the house. We were frightened because a lot of people were shouting and screaming. We thought, how are we going to get in? And there was a sort of, an entrance, side entrance into a yard. And I think we must have got in through there in the end. And my parents, they were frightened. They were saying we saw people being gathered and put into this, I don't remember, van or lorry or coach. We saw it from the window. And we thought my father was going to be taken, but he was very lucky. I don't know why. He was not taken.
I remember we were collected and taken to some place where we stayed overnight because there were so many fires around. And presumably those were the Jewish buildings and the synagogues that were set on fire. And I remember very clearly the next morning I went home and there was a family conference. And I can hear them sort of saying, but surely, this happens in the East, but it's not going to happen here.
He came home from school and found that his parents had been arrested and that he was on his own with his sister, and they were taken to an aunt's house.
Also had to go into other towns from time to time overnight when former customers came or rang my father to say the SA or the SS will come tonight into Jewish homes and beat up your family.
And somehow the times were bad enough for there to be a lot of talk about what was going to happen to the Jews in Europe, and particularly the children.
We realized that to have a future at all, I could not stay in Germany.
And then my father must have heard about the Kindertransport. So he went for that. He was hoping we would get into that. And we were very, very lucky, because he heard of somebody. He's supposed to be some far off relation of an aunt of mine, I don't know, somebody in London, a Mr. Barron. And he had a cigarette factory called Carreras in those days. And you had to pay £50 to the English government, so we were not, the government didn't have to sort of keep us. They were going to allow up to 10,000 unaccompanied children, no parents or anything, any age, up to 17. And father heard about it and he must have applied. And I remember going to the post office every day hoping we would hear something, and it got worse and worse. And one day the letter arrived. It was I forget which day, but my parents got us all ready. I remember they had a big cardboard flat box for everybody, and they put clothing in, new clothing and whatever. First of all, they were not going to send my youngest brother because he was only 3. Then they decided, they must have known how bad things are. They wouldn't tell us though. And they said, these boxes will be sent on to you. And we were allowed to take a little suitcase with us. So the day came, was it the 26th of August, 25th, 26th of August, something like this. My father took us to Frankfurt to go on the Kindertransport. I remember it very well. Went to the train station. There were hundreds of children and grown-ups. And our parents said, you'll be fine. We'll see you in a few weeks, in a couple of months. We're following on.
I was 8 and a half when I left. It was June the 13th, 1939.
Some knew where they were going, some had family, some were picked by others, some were left behind.
My twin brother was called Hans, and we were 10 years old when our parents told us that they were sending us to England.
I don't remember being consulted about coming.
And now we were to embark on a long journey to England. There we were to spend a considerable time with 2 English families, apparently for the purpose of learning English. We had never seen our beautiful capital before, that's Prague, never seen the sea, never been abroad or anywhere without our parents. And so it was with great anticipation that we set off by car to Prague. We chatted excitedly with our sister Greta, who was to join us in England later, unaware of our mothers and fathers' mounting tension and silence. The platform from which our train was to leave was crowded, most of whom were excited at the prospect of the adventure ahead. But why? Oh, why were there tears in our dear mother's gentle eyes when we said goodbye? And why was our father's voice so husky when he hugged us tightly and told us to be always good and diligent? And why, when we were in our compartment and the train about to set off, did that young mother suddenly lurch forward with a heart-rending cry, grab her pretty 3-year-old child sitting next to me, and stumble with her along the platform to the exit, sobbing uncontrollably? This really happened. At the time, I did not understand why. Mercifully, I did not realize that my brother and I would never see our parents, our sister, our grandparents, cousins and other relatives ever again. We had no inkling of the dreadful fate awaiting them.
I remember going through the Dutch border, and the Dutch people were very good. They sort of passed drinks and fruit. I was too sick to eat any anyway. And then we went on a boat and arrived in Harwich, and then went by train to Liverpool Street Station, and from there to Woburn House, which was the headquarters of one of the Jewish organizations at the time. And we waited there for collection, and I was collected and brought to Liverpool.
We had a sister, Greta, 4 years older than us. She was to come to England also a month later. Unfortunately, whereas our transport arrived on the 3rd of August in Harwich, hers, a month later, was stopped at the border between Germany and Holland because war had broken out just a matter of half an hour before, and the whole transport was sent back.
The British government, therefore, in this situation of imminent danger of invasion, had to guard against the possibility that there might be a fifth column in this country. And therefore, in a panic, they decided to intern all the male people and all the women who lived on the coast or on places 50 miles from the coast.
I never experienced any enmity, either as a German or on religious grounds. In fact, I was beginning to feel like a little English boy. And so internment on my 16th birthday came as a rather a surprise and a shock. At Huyton, subsequently, Huyton near Liverpool, where we were taken by train. And it was quite an intellectual atmosphere because most of my fellow internees were Cambridge University students and some lecturers and things.
We stayed there for a few days and then to the Isle of Man. The camp was at Douglas. There were other camps in the Isle of Man, and they were for German refugees. And there the population was intellectually at a much higher level than the Italian camps. We have plenty of people in the hotel trade, in the restaurant trade, fish and chips and ice cream, but not very many intellectuals. I think that the famous Amadeus Quartet was actually formed, or the beginning, in a camp in the Isle of Man, where the first, second violin and the viola players found themselves there. They didn't know each other before.
In 1944, when the German army occupied Hungary. May, they started the ghetto. From the ghettos came together in a few large houses. From there, we went to Szeged, a second largest city in Hungary, and they were there about thousands of people, all of southern Hungary. Now that before we are ready. We are ready to go to the camp, to the cattle car. I always remember, we didn't know nothing was going in the world. We didn't know nothing. And once a gendarme, a policeman asked me, he said, can you clean up those rubbish bins? Now that I told them, listen, nicely I clean it, don't you worry. But why I was so quickly volunteered, I have seen a piece of newspaper, what they throw in a day before. I took back to the barracks, you know, where we lived, and I showed my father. I couldn't believe it. Everybody was in joy. It was in the front page, in Hungarian, invasio, invasion. And under it was written that murderous fire of 10,000 planes and 2,000 ships, the Allied armies landed Normandy. I mean, that we knew, good news. We didn't know many other things. We didn't have the news or radio not allowed to. No Jewish family could have a radio since 1940. We went to the cattle cars and toward Auschwitz. But before Auschwitz, in the Polish border, nobody knows why, nobody knows how. The whole train turned back. I remember what happened today that I went to sleep and I woke up and I said to my father, listen, those are the bridges of Budapest. That is far away from Poland. And then he found out that he went to Austria from the death train to the train of the living to survive.
Olga had managed to gain employment as a French and English languages teacher in Trieste. My mother, Rachel, was a ballet dancer and she was flitting about Italy with various engagements. And Vicky had gained employment in a bookshop. And in fact, it was she first who started to resist the fascism by acting as an underhand resistance worker, delivering parcels to Allied resistance who were using the bookshop as a stopping off point to gather resources, food and other things, and moving on. And in about April 1944, the Gestapo became aware of the activity at this bookshop, and Olga's sister Vicky was arrested. She was taken to a transit camp called Fossili, and from there she was then moved on to Auschwitz. Olga, in the meantime, was still freely travelling, visiting my mother Rachel, But on one visit, Olga, on the way from Trieste to Milan, was caught on the train with what appeared to be suspicious books that could have been the property of a spy. Now, the Gestapo thought that because the books were in French and English, Olga was therefore working against the regime. She was arrested, and after a short period also at Fossili, she was sent to Auschwitz. On the evening of the 15th of June 1944, some girls from our block were waiting to go in for our first shower in the camp without soap or towel. As we waited, I saw a group of women deportees approaching with SS guards. The girls were talking with each other, and I thought I heard my sister's voice. "Olga?" I said to myself. "Here? Not possible." I waited until the group came nearer, and I shouted her name in disbelief. I wanted so much to be wrong. I was shocked when she actually turned round and looked at me. We did not have time to touch hands and only managed to say a few words. We wanted to embrace, but it would have been dangerous to attract the attention of the SS. Neither of us cried, but we were deeply saddened to meet in this terrifying place. Her younger sister, Vicky, being the weaker of the two, and also the fact that she wore spectacles. So Olga used to give up her bread ration to the hut block over in order for Vicky to have more food and also to make sure that none of the other inmates pestered her or tried to steal the food. She also managed to get her to come and live in the same hut, because at that time, if anyone found out, any of the Germans found out that people were relatives, then of course they would be split up, or even a worse fate might befall them. Later on, she managed to obtain employment for Vicky, so that they were both on what they call the shoe commando, stripping shoes, the shoes of the people that had arrived and would soon be going to a horrible death. They then went on these forced death marches because the Germans had realized that the Americans and the Russians were building up their firepower. People would march 5 abreast. And of course, if the Germans saw that anyone was dragging their feet or anything, they would simply shoot them and leave them to die in a ditch. But because they'd made a few other friends in the block, they stuck together. They held each other, arms through each other, and even marched sometimes with people sleeping. The sheer momentum of being supported and the need to keep those feet moving forward kept them alive. Well, that is the concentration camp number that every inmate, not just of Auschwitz, but of all the concentration camps, had tattooed on them, because it was part of the German policy to gradually reduce human beings to little more than ciphers. And if you steal somebody's identity first by stripping them down, cutting their hair, and just dressing them in striped pajamas in something that's shapeless and nameless, this is the last indignity, tattooing them as if they are animals, cows, pigs, waiting to be slaughtered. So, although you were for a while under the Nazis, you retained your identity, you were faithful to your origins, and you've returned to a Jewish environment. And that's a kind of victory, isn't it, Olga? Yes, it is, isn't it? Shalom. Shalom le'itraut. Hello and long life. That's what they say, don't they?
When the war was over, sitting on a bench nicely on the main square in the little town, always thinking about you. Who came home? Who came? Maybe they came, maybe they made it.
Nobody knew if there was anyone left to go back to. There wasn't for me.
In one way, you realized how lucky you were to have avoided all that, but on the other hand, you felt, well, I felt, I just wouldn't have left had I known the circumstances. it's difficult to say. One thing I must say, I've always felt equally at ease with non-Jewish and Jewish people. In fact, more so with non-Jewish people because of being brought up with them.
It was after the war started, those boxes arrived, I don't know how much later, so we had some clothing. And I remember this guarantor, must have maybe for Christmas or something, he gave me a dress, I remember it, a green, I thought it was beautiful, green woolen, something for the winter.
He often thought that he wondered why he'd survived and others hadn't. He never wanted to visit Vienna, but eventually in 1977, nearly 40 years after he left, we went back for a few days. Nothing, he remembered, was left. Their flat was a multi-storey car park, their shop a derelict site, and the school was a new block of flats. All physical connections had disappeared.
60 years after it all happened, all of a sudden people started talking about it and saying it mustn't be forgotten. I think it's to prevent it ever happening again.
It took many years for people, as now people talk about it openly, survivors of the second generation even talk about it, but in those days, just after the war, people felt that they had to get through it and get over it and almost forget about it.
Before one passes on, it is important to remember those who were involved and those who didn't survive. And if by so doing you get a bit upset talking about it, well, it's a worthwhile cause. But as for the future, I haven't got a crystal ball.
As we pass into the 21st century, the world, particularly Europe, inherited an indigestible piece of history, the Shoah, meaning the Holocaust, which cannot be understood, must not be forgotten, but may not be forgiven. Ben Kingsley. That's so true.